It's good to be back with you this morning and to share a little bit with you. Would you turn with me, please, to the book of Mark, chapter 10. I like the stories of the Bible. They speak to my heart. This is the story of a blind man by the name of Bartimaeus. So Mark chapter 10, and starts in the 46th verse and runs down to the end of the chapter. Mark chapter 10, verse 46 says, "Now they came to Jericho. As he went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great multitude, blind Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, sat by the road begging." He was blind. And when you're blind, you can't see where you're going, right? So it's hard to work. So he's sitting beside the road. I imagine sitting on his outer cloak, because they use that as a blanket and they use it as something to sit on and something to keep warm at night in. And he was saying, "Alms, alms," and the crowd began to come. He heard noise and people and began to ask, and he had to ask a little bit louder, and pretty soon his curiosity got the best of him, and he said, "What's going on?" "Oh, Jesus is coming." And he had heard of Jesus. The word had gone out that Jesus had healed people, and the thought had come to his mind. Maybe the Holy Spirit put it there. Maybe it was just frustration with blindness, but he said, maybe Jesus can heal my blindness. Verse 47, when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Now this phrase, Son of David, is something that the Jewish people understood to be referred to the Messiah. So here he was talking to Jesus if he was the Messiah, and he hadn't checked with the Jewish leaders to see if it was okay to use that phrase with all its power-packed emotion, for everyone wanted the Son of David to return. Apparently it wasn't okay, and they tried to shut him up. Verse 48. Then many warned him to be quiet, but he cried out the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and commanded him to be called. Then they called the blind man, saying to him, "Cheer up." He rose up and came to Jesus. "He's calling you." Oh, verse 50. Throwing aside his garment. Now, if you're a blind man, you're likely rather poor in those days, and you had that to warm up in, right, and sit on. So it's about your only possession, maybe. Maybe he had family to support him. But it says overtly here that he left his cloak behind him. Now, if you're blind, how are you going to find that again, right? I mean, that could easily be trampled or taken or just about anything. And he, in faith, left it there and rose and came to Jesus. Verse 51, Jesus answered and said unto him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Now, come on, Jesus. Isn't it obvious? He's a blind man. He wants to see. But Jesus wanted to hear Bartimaeus state it clearly. I wonder if Jesus still does that today. What do you want me to do for you? The blind man said to him, "Teacher," Rabboni, "that I may receive my sight." Then Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." Can you imagine the excitement, the wonder, the joy in Bartimaeus' face when his eyes all of a sudden began to see? And when God does a miracle, it can take quite a bit. I don't know why Bartimaeus was blind. Maybe he had cataracts. That could be. He might have been able to see light. But he may have also been born blind. We don't know that, right? If someone is born blind, to even know what they're looking at takes some brain development. God has the ability to bring all that together. So Bartimaeus looks into the face of Jesus, and I just love his response. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus on the road. I didn't say anything about going back to get his cloak. I'm curious as to whether he actually did. But his joy was to be with Jesus. Isn't that neat? Sometimes Jesus does miracles. Have you ever had a miracle happen in your life? God gets involved in our lives. And sometimes things that we just can't explain, except they happen. And it's so hard to believe. I know I have had some of those in my own life and watched them happen in others. What is it that makes a miracle? Do you think God knew what he was doing? I think we call it a miracle when we don't understand what happened. It looks unexplainable to us, right? It looks like God got involved personally. And God has been involved in our lives. Sometimes he heals miraculously, and sometimes he doesn't heal miraculously. Have you ever prayed for someone to get well and they didn't get well? Have you prayed for a cancer to go away, or some knee pain to leave, or whatever the discomfort may be, and then nothing happens? I've had the opportunity through the years to help a number of people make lifestyle changes. I think, where's Jim hiding? Did he just leave? Okay, well, we love him anyhow. I think a couple of years ago, I was just going to refer to you, Jim, as a, you don't have to come up front. I just wanted to say there's a miracle, okay? Right? He decided to make some lifestyle changes, and when he made those lifestyle changes, the physiology changed, and it took a few months. But the energy came back, and things continue to get better. That's kind of a miracle too, isn't it? Amen. And it's not the same as a Bartimaeus miracle, but it's its own unique kind of miracle. And I've seen this happen in many people's lives. When that happens, we see God's laws, God's rules of how he runs his universe at work in our lives. And when we have broken those rules, sometimes, and I think last time I was here, I talked to you about the law of gravity, remember? Can you break the law of gravity? No, you jump from the Empire State Building and it looks fine at the 150th floor. The 100th floor, it's still great. The 50th floor, it's fine, but when you hit the sidewalk, it's not fine, right? You can't break God's law of gravity. You only prove it to be correct. And that's the way it is. Interestingly enough, God has so built our bodies, and I think this is miraculous. The more I know about the body, the more amazed I am about what God has built into it. So often, if we just bring our lives back into line with his laws, there's a healing that takes place that is miraculous. And we have an opportunity to do that. There are many laws of the body, and we could spend some time talking about multiple of God's laws, but this morning I've decided to speak to you about the law of rest. And the sermon title is The Rest of the Story. Do you know that God has built rest, the need for rest, into your system? Some children, when they are born and kind of come home and start to grow up, the mother or the father or maybe a teacher will notice that the child has a lazy eye. You know anybody who's had that? The eye kind of heads off to the side, and it's lazy. Instead of looking at what it's supposed to be looking at, it's lazy. We call it amblyopia. And in order to fix this, you see, if we just let that happen, that eye that's wandering off to the side will lose its sight. That eye will quit working. The person will be blind in that eye, will lose the ability to tell distances as well. So how does the doctor manage that? Well, the eye doctor will put a patch on the good eye so the bad eye has to work, right? Because if we rest too much, if we just don't use things at all, they tend to not work, right? And the rule is use it or lose it. At the same time, we're supposed to use it, we can overuse it, right? I just heard on, I think, British Broadcasting yesterday on my way home from the hospital or the clinic. I heard a little piece about nearsightedness. You heard about nearsightedness? And apparently I didn't know this until I heard it from the British Broadcasting, but people who spend a lot of time looking at books tend to have a problem with nearsightedness. So we have to use the eyeballs, right? But then there's a time for rest. If we're always looking at a book, we may kind of throw things off. So there's a need for rest. We're busy. I'll bet a lot of you are as busy as I am trying to get through life and make ends meet, right? And sometimes we need to just sit back and rest. When we exercise physically, we need to rest. Do you know people who run a marathon have if they run too hard and too long, their immune system gets weak. They need to stop and rest so it can rejuvenate. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to work at a place called Lifestyle Center of America. And as I went in, I was telling people about the importance of exercise and, of course, how to eat and all of the things that we were encouraging people to do. And I knew that down in the gym there was an exercise physiologist. Harold was his name. And I said, I better go figure out what Harold is telling people so I know we're saying the same things to the patients that come in. So I went down and I said to Harold, Harold, tell me what you do. And he said, okay, let's get you scheduled for a treadmill. I said, no, Harold, just tell me what you do. All right? He said, well, we'll schedule you for a treadmill. I hadn't asked to exercise. I had asked to learn, and I expected him to tell me. Well, Harold had a very practical way of teaching me. And so we set the date, and I ended up in my gym shorts on the treadmill with Harold guiding me. Now, you know how the treadmill is. It's got this thing you walk on. It starts low when the doctors do it. They've got wires on your chest to measure what your heart is doing. And Harold had brought out the metabolic cart. Now, you all may not know what a metabolic cart is, but it's a carbon dioxide sensor. So they put this thing in your mouth, so while you're exercising, you have to breathe all your air in and out through this machine, and it measures then when you run out of oxygen. It lets them know directly when that happened. So Harold put me on the exercise machine, and I ran as hard as I could. The news is with treadmills is the machine always wins. So every 3 minutes it got steeper, excuse me, and it got faster. And I tell you what, the machine won. So I huffed and I puffed and I slowed down. This was, 15, 18 years ago. And I got off the machine and Harold said to me, well, George, not bad for a 65-year-old man. Now, I was nowhere near 65 at that time. I am now, but I wasn't then. And I said, Harold, you have a way of insulting me with the back of his hand, right? I mean, it was a kind way of saying you're out of shape. So then Harold taught me a new exercise, a way of exercising that had rest with it. You see, I had never been a runner. I think I ran a mile in high school twice, and it nearly killed me both times, right? I mean, walking was more my style. Short spurts, yes, but running a long while, not me. So Harold said, what you need to do is to do exercise, and you do exercise for part of the minute, and you rest. And then you exercise, and then you rest. Every minute has some rest, and every minute has some exercise in it. And so he taught me how to get to a target heart rate, to exercise up, and when my heart rate got up to the target, to bring it back down. And the neat thing was, he didn't want me to exercise so hard I was out of breath. I had to keep it relatively low because that's the safest and the best place to exercise. That's what he was teaching people with diabetes and hypertension and obesity and heart disease, because it's safe. You exercise, and then you rest. You exercise, and I started on the rowing machine because I knew I didn't want to run. And then I tried to walk, and I couldn't get my heart rate up high enough. And I said, well, if I can rest, then maybe I could run. So I went outside, and there was a hill. I could go down, I could run down, and then I could kind of walk up, and that made me feel like I was doing it right. So I did this and tried to do it every day until, with my little heart rate monitor on, so I knew where my heart rate was. And about 6 weeks later, Harold said, okay, George, it's time to get you scheduled for your next treadmill. I said, okay. And so I ended up at the scheduled time in my gym shorts with this crazy thing in my mouth again, the little cup to catch the spit because it's really hard to swallow when you're breathing through a mouthpiece. And again, the machine started low, and then it got steeper and faster, and again, the machine won. This time when I got off the machine, Harold said to me, good job, George. You have the average fitness for a college PE major. He paused, and then he said, female. And I said, I'll take it. And what I learned that exercise with rest keeps the lactic acid from building up in the muscle. Lactic acid actually decreases the amount of pleasure we get from exercise. Harold told me his goal was for people enjoy exercise, not hate to do it. And in order to do that, you need to release the endorphins. Have you heard of those? I like to call them outdorphins because it's nice to get outside to get some exercise. And if I exercise and rest, I get those outdorphins. I feel good without getting the lactic acid, which decreases those endorphins and takes the pleasure away. So that was a real important lesson about rest. Yes, it's important to work. Yes, it's important to move, but it's also important to rest. What about your nighttime rest? Some people have a hard time with nighttime rest. They go to sleep and they just can't go to sleep, or they go to bed and they can't go to sleep. There can be a variety of reasons for this. Sometimes people are watching screens all night, and you know that light from the screen tends to make it harder to sleep. Some people never get outside and never see the sunlight. Did you know that sunlight in the daytime helps you go to sleep at night? The earlier you see that sunlight in the morning, the easier it'll be for you to go to sleep. And if you'll get out in the sunshine about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that'll help you stay asleep. If you have trouble waking up at 2, 3, or 4 in the morning, it helps get you all have heard of this, right? Melatonin, that kind of sleep hormone, it increases it in the brain. And so having a good night's rest is important. God recognized that we needed that time to repair. The brain uses the first half of the night to clean up the garbage that collected in your brain, and the second half of the night it uses to put the connections together, and that's when as the brain kind of grows and repairs and fixes itself. When God told the children of Israel and how to set up their economy, he recommended, he commanded that they would go to the feast days. You remember the Passover? And then there was the 50 days, that was what was it called? Pentecost. That's what we call it more in the New Testament, yeah. And then, that's right, Pentecost, it was 50 days. It was celebrating when the law was given on Sinai. That's when it was. That's correct. And then the Day of Atonement. So every Jewish, certainly adult male person was required to go to Jerusalem. And you can imagine that was a party time. That was a rest time. You get acquainted with your friends. It was a time to leave work and come and remember God's blessings and to enjoy fellowship together. God built in vacations into the Jewish economy. Good news, huh? And then, of course, you remember every seventh year there was a special day when the land was supposed to be put at rest. And then 7 sevens, there was kind of a reset of all the property. So God wanted rest to happen. I'm thankful that God likes rest and gives us rest. The 10 Commandments have a rest required in them. We're all here to celebrate that, aren't we? The Sabbath day is God's rest day. Now, I would remind you that the 4th commandment does not say, remember the rest day. It says, remember the rest day to keep it holy. There's a very special thing that God has for us during this rest day. I don't know if any of you have read Des Cummings' book, Original Love, but I appreciate his emphasis in there. Sabbath was made for love. A time for us to reset. We live in a world where there's a lot of battling going on. We're fighting, we're hurting, we are struggling, working hard all day, whatever it may be. When Sabbath comes, it's a time to step aside, to step into the culture of eternity. God says, leave your work behind. I'm going to take care of you. Just like He took care of them on every 7th year when the land was supposed to rest. The food was provided by the land. God made sure that happened. And God provides for us when He says, come apart on the Sabbath day, the rest day, and keep it holy. Because Jesus wants to come close to us. His name was Bruce Alexander. He is a researcher, actually, University of British Columbia. And in 1979, he published a very interesting article in a journal called Psychopharmacology. There were some very interesting things that had been learned from watching mice. They noticed they put mice in a cage and gave them the food they needed, but then they had a choice of 2 watering troughs. One watering site gave them just plain water, and the other watering site gave them water with morphine. Now, what do you know about morphine? Well, it's addicting. It brings some little bit of pleasure to the brain. And what they noticed was, and this sounds pretty obvious to us, right? You guessed it. When the rats had a choice between the two, they took morphine, the morphine water. As a matter of fact, they just loved that stuff because it made them feel good. It released in their brain something called dopamine. Dopamine makes us feel good. And these rats would take this water until it killed them because they were looking for a little more of that morphine, that dopamine hit that would come to their brain and make them feel good. Well, in those days, the way they dealt with rats, and maybe you've seen this, each rat or mouse had its own cage. And of course, they wanted to know what each mouse would do. If they wanted to measure for one mouse, they'd have to have one mouse in one cage, right? So they lined all the cages up, and then they saw what happened with the mice. And Bruce Alexander said, that's very interesting. I wonder what would happen if we put these rats in a social environment. So he made a big cage, which he called a rat park. So it had places to play. The rats could interact with each other. They could go on the wheels. They could tumble, interact, eat, whatever they wanted to do. And then he put in the cage water, and water with morphine. And while it's true that the rats took a little bit of the water with morphine, they took a lot more of the regular water, and none of them got addicted to it, and they did much better. Isn't it interesting? Just being together, and the rats were not addicted. And they tried to explain what was going on with this. We've actually seen this same phenomenon in other places. And I would like to explain that a little to you because I think it may be helpful to you in understanding how your brain works and how God works miracles in our lives. You remember the Vietnam War? Fortunately, I missed it. I mean, I didn't have to go in. The draft ran out before I turned 18, so I missed it. But I've interacted with a lot of folks who were soldiers there. And I know that it was an extremely difficult time for them. Many of them still have scars because of what happened. And I mean emotional scars. And of the United States soldiers in Vietnam, it was estimated that 20% of them were addicted to drugs, morphine, heroin, whatever it was. It was such a stressful environment. There was so much stress. They wanted something to bring them some pleasure. And in order to get that pleasure, they would start taking substances. Now, what happened when those soldiers came back home after the war? Now, I know they didn't all get a very good reception. I'm sure family and, mom and dad and girlfriend and kids and welcomed them home. But it's very interesting that 95% of those soldiers just quit those drugs like that when they got back into an environment where there was some love and socializing and interaction and people cared for them and there was meaning. When the fear was gone, they put away those things that they were addicted to. Isn't that interesting? So we think that's a reflection of what was happening with the rats. You see, in our brain, there's you all have probably seen pictures of it. I suppose I could have put a slide up, but you got the frontal lobes up front, and then it goes backwards, and then there's the pieces that come forward on the side. In those little pieces on the side, in the middle of those pieces, is a little something called the amygdala. Amygdala, I think in Latin, means something like almond. It's relatively small. We've discovered that its job is to kind of interact with our emotions. It's part of the limbic system, we think, something that deals with our emotions. And especially on the right side of our brain, it reacts with fear. So when there's fear, the amygdala fires. And, of course, our heart races faster, things happen. Let's say, for example, I'm in the office and I'm seeing a patient and the fire alarm goes off. So first thing that happens is my amygdala goes, emergency, that's loud, there's something important. And then my frontal lobe says, now wait a minute, they said there was going to be a fire alarm check, right? So I calm down. I may stick my head out in the hall and nobody else seems panicked and I don't see any smoke. So the amygdala strikes the fear and the frontal lobe says, well, the logical thing is this is not a real dangerous situation. I think we're going to be fine. And so my heart rate calms down and things are better. Does that make sense to you? So the frontal lobe is where our logic is. It's where our sense of right and wrong are. And those two things meet at something called the anterior cingulate cortex. How was that for a big word? I practiced for a month to be able to say that, okay? So it's right between the frontal lobes, right back in the middle. So it's kind of deep, but it's right between the two. And it's that little area where the brain does its kind of management of the emotions and then the frontal lobe. The reasoning and the emotions meet there, and that is where those things happen. So logic and emotions meet. So here's addiction with this dopamine, because dopamine just really makes us feel pleasurable. For those of you who may be tempted, please stay away from cocaine. It is the strongest stimulant of dopamine that we know of. And dopamine feels so good, you can hardly believe it, and you want some more of it. Some of you who haven't tried cocaine may still understand something of dopamine when you have a pleasurable event. Let's say, for example, that... Anybody ever give you chocolates? Yeah, okay. Chocolates are wonderful, aren't they? So you take that bite and it just feels so good and it tastes wonderful. That releases in your brain this dopamine and you say, I like that. Same thing happens to me with ice cream, okay? I just love ice cream. But it feels so good I want another one. And so I go for another bite. And the second bite doesn't give me quite as much dopamine as the first one. And the third one's a little less, and the fourth one's a little less. And pretty soon I'm eating faster and faster till I reach the bottom of the ice cream carton, right? Or the whole box of chocolates is gone. Do you recognize this phenomenon? So this is a dopamine phenomenon. Cocaine is absolutely the worst one that we have. But we all run into it. As a matter of fact, there are lots of things we are addicted to, and those addictions tend to come when dopamine is up front. And we're feeling that, and we're enjoying it, and we want more of that, and more of that, and more of that. And so these soldiers, and so the mice, were getting the dopamine, and they wanted more because it brought pleasure. In case of the soldiers, there was a lot of fear. There's a hormone called vasopressin that's released in the brain that really brings the fear up. And when the fear comes and the frontal lobe is turned off or not able to control it, as in the Vietnam War, this stress just builds and builds and builds and builds, and we've got to find some release for it. So our human way of doing that is to add some dopamine. And so we go look for things to eat, things to smoke, things to drink. These are the things that we do to try to manage it. Now, what the mice have taught us is that there is another hormone that puts the frontal lobe back in charge and removes the dopamine pleasure. Well, not the pleasure. It controls it. It doesn't remove it completely. It simply puts the frontal lobe back in place. And that hormone is called oxytocin. Have you heard of it? Those of you in the medical field have certainly learned of it in your physiology class. I've delivered babies in the past, and we used a lot of oxytocin, we called it pitocin, in the labor room to help the uterus contract. Now, that's very odd. As I thought about it, why would the love hormone, oxytocin, be so useful in labor? Those of you who have delivered a baby, and I mean delivered it yourself. See, I've helped women do it, but I know the women actually do it, right? That experience can be pretty amazing. I have caught many a baby, and what I notice is that during labor, there's a lot of emotion, usually. Now, some of you in this modern world may have a spinal or something, so you're not feeling anything. But in my day, we didn't use that quite so much. And I've been kicked and sworn at and all kinds of things, right? Until the next morning. And with all that dopamine, with all that oxytocin, mama is in love with this child. Right? That experience was nothing. It's kind of gone. The love overwhelms that stress. And indeed, that's what we understand happens. When love is present, it pushes kind of the dopamine back in place. It puts the frontal lobe in charge. Now, After carrying that child for 9 months and getting that incredible surge of oxytocin, Mama is willing and ready to get up in the middle of the night and have her sleep interrupted so she can care for that child. Oxytocin is powerful in changing our behavior, in changing our mind, and, interestingly, in removing our addictions. If we're anxious, how do we calm the circuits? Anxiousness, the amygdala's firing, you got the vasopressin going. In order to get things back in control, what's needed? Some love, some oxytocin. We get oxytocin by being close to other people, by touching people, by being hugged. There's a lot of ways by interacting that we get this oxytocin to help heal us. Abuse relationships, people have been so hurt they can't even sense. It's so hard. There's so much of the stress hormones, that vasopressin, the fearful one, that they can hardly sense. But with time, with regular oxytocin and love, those things can be put back in place. What does the Bible say? I think 1 John 4:18, perfect love casts out fear. And I would suggest to you on this Sabbath day that the God of creation comes near to us on Sabbath in a special way to give us an extra dose of oxytocin. He said, you need to come together with your brothers and sisters. You need to interact with a Heavenly Father that loves you. You need to be reminded that God loves you. Because every time we do that, we get oxytocin. And oxytocin helps to remove our addictions. Oxytocin helps to put us back where we belong. We do not have a God that is far away. We do not live in a world that is missing in hope. We have an incredible hope. We have a God who loves us intently and dearly and has gone out of His way. I think it's a miracle when God comes each Sabbath day to meet with us. You know, it's outside of the normal thing. Some people believe God created the world and just let it go. You know, it's spinning out there. Deism, I think they call it. We know that's not true, and God gave us the Sabbath to remind us, I'm coming to be with you on Sabbath. I want you to know that I love you. I want you to have that oxytocin. I want you to be healed. I am thankful for a God who heals us. Let's sing about that love. The hymn 191, Love Divine.